All right, thanks, Brianna. All right, well, let's go ahead and get started. Are we okay to start, Mike?
Yeah, as far as I know, we are.
As far as you know, all right, we're on, we're live.
We're winning.
Just want to welcome everyone to our first Power Friday. I'll stand over here so the owl can see me better. Our first Power Friday for the academic year. Very excited to have a great startup and a great lineup and a great topic for our first Power Friday. And also welcome to our folks online. I think a few more people will be logging on. We have a few more folks straggling in, so and if you need to leave early, that's fine. Just a couple logistical things. We'll have lunch. It'll be delivered around 11:45, and then you're welcome to stay here in the room. Hopefully continue the conversations from the great points that are raised in the presentations. So as I was thinking about the topic to start off with, obviously a big topic, a big concern for a lot of us, especially as we're still in the pandemic, but hopefully emerging to, getting back more to normal, whatever that means, is concerns about student wellness and social emotional learning. And not only for the students, but teachers, graduate students, others. I mean, these are really, really important topics. And so looking about the expertise we have here in the college, we have a lot of expertise, but we've got two great new faculty members. Rawan, not so new, was new last year, so now in her second year, and Ofelia, who just started with us this year. And one of the inspirations too was I saw that Ofelia and our keynote speaker, Megan, have a brand new book that just came out within the last couple of weeks, right? Called Developing Trauma-Informed Teachers, Creating Classrooms that Foster Equity, Resilience, and Asset-Based Approaches, Reflections on Curricular and Program Implementations. And so that was really the inspiration for the workshop. And then I was reflecting on Rawan, and she's doing great work related to Arab American communities and well-being within the populations there. So I thought this would be a great way to bring together work being done across both departments and great work being done nationally that's represented by our keynote speaker, Megan. So we're going to start off today with Rawan's presentation. Dr. Rawan Atari-Kahn, she's an assistant professor in counseling psychology. Her topic will be identifying the meaning of well-being among Arab Americans. About 20 minutes or so for presentation. We'll have time for Q&A afterwards. And then around 10:30, Dr. Ofelia Schepers will present. She's an assistant professor of literacy and language, English language learning. We are fortunate to steal her away from Metropolitan State University, Denver. Is that correct? Got that right? And has done some great work as well, collaborating with Megan. Dr. Schepers is going to present on pre-service approach to developing trauma-informed teachers. And then after her presentation, we'll be pleased to hear from our keynote speaker all the way from Colorado, right? You're based in Colorado. Dr. Megan Brennan, who she's the co-founder of Resilient Futures, which is a nonprofit in Denver, Colorado that supports early childhood K-12 educators in schools and school districts, university programs, and youth-serving agencies to implement and sustain trauma-informed practices that centralize equity work. Dr. Brennan practices as a school-based therapist working in K-12 schools with an expertise in providing trauma-specific therapies. So not only scholars who study this work, but are actually in the schools working with people doing this work. So I think we're in for a really informative session today. So with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Atari-Kahn. Thanks for being here.
Which one? Do I do this one?
Yeah, that's that.
Okay, perfect. Thank you, Wayne, and thanks everyone for being here and for the folks online. Today I'll be talking about work that I started in my graduate studies focused on Arab and MENA communities. And when I say MENA, I'm referring to Middle Eastern and North African communities. So let me start just by giving a little bit of background about who are Arab Americans. So Arab Americans can trace their roots back to the MENA region. Now the MENA region includes Arab countries as well as non-Arab countries such as Turkey and Armenia and Iran. But I will be focusing specifically on Arab American communities. But I did want to acknowledge that right now there's this larger push for the term MENA because it is more inclusive and it also ties really well in terms of some of the advocacy work that's being done to include a MENA category on the US Census. So I'll talk a little bit about kind of the purpose behind that. But folks from the MENA region started immigrating to the US in the late 1800s. and it's been ongoing since. Typically, we talk about immigration within 4 waves, and we see most current waves, as probably all of us are aware, right, due to political turmoil in the Middle East, ongoing warfare. A lot of people are leaving their homelands and finding refuge in countries that are not their homeland. So, and much of the time, kind of MENA or Arab people, sometimes we'll say Arab/MENA, are brought together because of our shared cultural, linguistic, and in some cases, our shared religious identities. So like I briefly mentioned, there's a movement right now to include a MENA category, a MENA racial category on the next US Census in 2030. These have been ongoing efforts for the past couple of decades. It's nothing necessarily new, and there was a hope that there would be a category in the 2020 census, but that didn't happen. And for that reason, so Arab and MENA people are racially classified as white or Caucasian. So one kind of consequence of this is that we're often an understudied and underrepresented group because we kind of get lost in this larger category. So even when you're thinking about applying to research grants that specifically call out for studies on BIPOC communities, a lot of times we don't see Arab and Middle Eastern people explicitly named in that because a lot of forms use the US Census categories to kind of replicate, right? So then we see this kind of effect being proliferated. So minority status is often overlooked, but what we do know in terms of the research is that Arab Americans, when given the opportunity to do so, would rather check a MENA racial category than a white racial category. And they often report experiences similar to other ethnic and racial minority communities in terms of discrimination, kind of hostile national context. We see a lot of anti-Arab sentiment, and you can see the image I have here is the model of cumulative racial ethnic trauma for Americans of MENA descent. So this is really kind of a culmination of works that depicts the ongoing stressors that Arab and MENA Americans face living in the United States. So you can see there's some of these kind of micro level factors such as interpersonal discrimination, but then we stretched out to the macro level thinking about institutional forms, let alone kind of things like historical trauma too that are impacting people on an individual level. So much of the research, although we don't have a lot of research on Arab Americans specifically like within the psychology literature, the work that we do have is really focused on impacts of discrimination. We really saw an increase in published articles after 9/11. And that is really kind of where the emphasis is placed on the psychological distress that this community has experienced. And that work has been really important and imperative, especially in this fight to include a MENA category on the census. But now, really, scholars have come together to say we need to kind of shift a little bit and start focusing on kind of like sources of strength, sources of resilience, well-being within these communities to also ask this bigger question of what can kind of Arab MENA culture contribute to our understandings of well-being. And that fits with this kind of larger movement that we're seeing in counseling psychology right now to decolonize the field, which really is just meaning like, let's really look at our interventions and our models, question who are they created for and who created them, right? And do they fit for everyone? So that gives you just a bit of background on kind of the Arab MENA research up to this point. So to touch on well-being, scholars have typically talked about well-being kind of within these different frameworks, specifically in the psych literature on thinking about subjective well-being. This is a lot of Ed Diener's work where he talks about life satisfaction, positive affect, and then psychological well-being, which is a lot of Carol Riff's work. So her focus is really on kind of striving to be one's ideal self. And for a bit, the kind of literature took kind of 2 different turns. But what we're seeing is that there's actually a lot of overlap between these frameworks. And when we're thinking about like how do we assess well-being, that we should be including both of these pieces in here. So you can see I have kind of 2 big scales that we see often in the psych literature, the satisfaction with life scale and Riff scales of psychological well-being that are frequently used and really are rooted in these theories. All right, so what do we know about well-being in terms of culture? Well, we do know that there has been some research kind of exploring the effects and influence of culture on well-being. But a lot of this research has really been focused on kind of comparing traditionally individualistic societies with collectivist societies. And we see some of these individual differences. So respondents from the United States are more likely to endorse kind of self-oriented dimensions of well-being like self-acceptance or autonomy, whereas folks such as from Japan and Korea in some studies really did not endorse those dimensions, but more likely to lean towards kind of this interconnectedness, focus on relationships with others. So we see this is kind of, we're starting to think about how does culture really play a role in well-being. But there's been this shift to kind of stop focusing on necessarily comparison studies, right? And take a little pause, focus on one culture and really do a deep dive into those cultures. And that's what a little bit of my work was as a graduate student and has kind of persisted up to this point. Okay, so this is just a breakdown of some of the well-being measures that so these were actually primarily the measures seen with 23 studies that focused on Arab samples in the US and in the Middle East. These are the three that came up the most. So scales 1 and 2 were created in Western context, right? They were the ones that I mentioned earlier. And I bolded a couple of the dimensions in scale 1 of self-acceptance and autonomy that Carol Riff herself, the developer of the scale, she talked about like these dimensions in specific may not fit for folks who don't ascribe to these individualistic values as much as they do collectivistic values. So, and then the satisfaction with life scale, this is a pretty like brief 5-item measure. It's very much self-oriented as well. But this last measure is unique because this is the subjective well-being assessment scale. This was created very recently, you can see 2017, and the items on this scale were created based on interviews with Palestinians living in West Bank and Gaza Strip. So this is really a well-being measure, right, that was created within part of the Middle East. So I bolded some of the kind of dimensions on here that stand out in terms of being unique compared to these first two measures. So you see there is an entire mention on spirituality, so the role of spirituality and religion in someone's well-being. There is an entire dimension on economic security. So this was really about kind of fears about financial stability, fears about losing your home, and that human instability piece really captured that too in terms of it was measuring how safe and secure someone felt in their situation, which if you know about what's happening in Palestine, probably makes a lot of sense that these items came up. So the question with measure 3 is, obviously Arabs living in the US is a different context than Palestine. So the question really is, which dimensions might be relevant for Arab Americans, which might not. And keeping in mind that piece of, although this is clearly a different context than living in Palestine, I also mentioned those kind of ongoing cumulative stressors that Arab Americans experience here and citing that earlier work. So it's really starting to think about, well, maybe there are some pieces here that are relevant for Arabs in the US.
What is negative functioning?
So that one was kind of, the items on there were things like, I have nightmares, I have anxiety, I feel physical pain. So it's kind of like the flip side of well-being. Mm-hmm. All right, so this is the work that I started in my doctoral studies. With all of this kind of background in mind, I sought to create a measure of well-being for Arab Americans. And I used an emic approach, meaning that I started with pre-existing measures of well-being, satisfaction with life scale, the RIF scales, the subjective well-being assessment scale, to really see, what parts of those measures may be relevant and might we keep for a measure for Arab Americans. And then I followed through with 2 pilot studies. So I sought feedback from experts, so scholars in the field that focus on Arab mental health, I asked them their kind of perspectives about these measures, and I'll talk to you about a bit about that. And then the second pilot study was actually reaching out to community members and getting an idea from them of what their understandings and experiences of well-being are. And I took an academic approach because I think that there's this important piece to focus on right, I'm focusing on Arab Americans, Arabs living in the US. So thinking about like the acculturation process, the tendency to adopt kind of heritage cultural values, but also adopting the cultural values of the land that you're living in. So I wanted to recognize that piece as well, because what we do see in the research is that Arab Americans tend to adopt bicultural identities. So taking on kind of both of these pieces. All right, so this was some information on pilot study 1. So this was where I reached out to experts. There was 3 experts in the field on Arab mental health, and I asked them to really evaluate these 3 measures that I talked about initially and ask them questions such as, are these measures fitting for Arab Americans? Are there things missing? Are there things we need to change from these measures? So they provided both quantitative and qualitative feedback and answering scale questions as well as some open-ended questions. And really the findings showed us that these 3 experts thought that these current well-being measures could be made to be more culturally relevant for Arab Americans. So they suggested the kind of biggest missing piece was that there was no family-related items on any of these measures. So that was kind of the glaring missing piece. And then they thought that there needed to be more spirituality and faith-based questions that also didn't focus primarily on necessarily believing in one God, but keeping it open to capture kind of a variety of experiences when it comes to spirituality. All right, so then in pilot study 2, I had 15 Arab American participants respond to surveys so there was kind of different parts of the survey. So in part 1, they responded to some open-ended questions about what does well-being mean to you? What does living a good life mean to you? And then I also provided them with kind of some of these dimensions of well-being that I've already talked about, showed them what I mean by, like, I asked them to create scale items, kind of in a rough way, but I gave them an example of what that process could look like. And then the last part was really asking them, is there anything missing from these measures that we've overlooked? So we used thematic analysis to kind of code all this data, and these were some of the dominating themes in the data. So participants talked about the importance of caring for their family, both emotionally and financially. They talked about family and community influence on their decisions, such as who they're going to marry, where they will live, what career they will pursue. And then we saw religion and spirituality come out as a larger theme, and thinking about like how that's attached to discovering life's purpose, bringing someone peace. And we saw this piece about, worries of safety, identity-related concerns. So across these 2 pilot studies, a total of 33 new well-being items were created in addition to 1 dimension. So you can see that new dimension we labeled collective decision-making, and these are some of the items that came up. Okay, moving into the main study. So this is when we actually started to test the new measure and see what items would hold up through factor analysis and which wouldn't. So you can see the eligibility criteria under participants. We recruited primarily through listserv, social media, reaching out to Arab and Muslim organizations across the US, and also snowball method. A lot of it was also using my personal connections. And asking people to kind of share out the survey. And you can see the instruments that they completed. So they completed all of the new items as well as the previous measures that I mentioned with this academic approach and a happiness scale. All right, so this was kind of tiny. I don't know if you can see all of this, but this was our final sample pool. We had 604 participants complete the entire survey. which was really excellent because this is also a very difficult community to reach. And we started collecting during March of 2020. So I think that's also something to keep in mind. This was a well-being survey at the start of the pandemic. Inevitably, there were some, I think, effects there to consider. But essentially what we did is we broke the samples randomly into two for an exploratory and a confirmatory factor analysis. And what we saw is that there was really no major differences in terms of demographics. So like gender was pretty equally split, or biological sex, and kind of education level, student status. So pretty similar once we created that split. So these were the results from the exploratory factor analysis. We used principal axis factoring, and we determined that 6 factors were kind of the best fit for the data. We did test about 7 and 8 factor, but this one yielded to kind of be the best fit. So you can see how we labeled each dimension, and then under each of those, I just have a couple example items of what fell under each factor. So we've got positive experiences, spirituality, collective decision-making. This new dimension did emerge in the EFA. Growth fostering encounters, economic security did come up, and then there's this piece of safety and identity. So some pretty big differences, you know, in the RIF scales, self-acceptance, autonomy items, they didn't hold, they were dropped during this process. So some of those pieces that I brought up early on were evident in this process that we took. And then the CFA results confirmed the 6-factor structure. However, you might see we had some low reliability coefficients, and those are kind of things that we're working on right now. One thing with the CFA is that we have collected more data to get a larger sample. Ideally, we want a 1 to 10 ratio for every one item, 10 participants, and right now our ratio is about 1 to 5. So it's likely underpowered. So we're working on that piece to see what comes up. I looked at convergent validity. So we had them fill out that happiness scale, and we found that it was significantly and positively correlated for both samples, which was expected kind of based on the literature. Limitations were that the sample was largely representative of second-generation immigrants, most of them identifying Arab American women. I think it's funny that all of these identities are my own identities, because I think this is an indication, right, of like, I was reaching out to the folks that I knew, and there was that limitation. So in collecting the second round of data, we really tried to be intentional about capturing other identities. Because what we actually know is that a majority of Arab Americans in the US are Christian, identifying they're not Muslim. So this really wasn't very representative in that way. And then I mentioned kind of these less than satisfactory internal consistencies that we're looking at for some of these factors. So this is a work in progress very much, and I've continued to work on this, but just in thinking about some of the implications, training in clinical, thinking about training mental health clinicians, psychologists, we really talk about trying to reduce capturing this cultural bias in the client's functioning. If we don't do that, we also risk pathologizing certain behaviors. So I think this measure kind of lends a hand to that and thinking about how to work with Arab American clients. And then research, potentially enhancing, the accuracy of our findings, thinking about kind of the cultural validity piece. And I think it's unique in the sense as that the scale captures values within the Arab culture that we identified through the pilot studies, but then also recognizes the influence of Western values. So it's really interesting because the final scale, it was 45 items or so, and it was nearly an even split in terms of half of the items were the brand new items created, and the other half of the items were from the previously established measures. So this is the final kind of view of what we're working with right now in terms of our 6 dimensions of well-being, a little bit about what they mean. And yeah, I'll give you a second to kind of look through that. I believe this is my last slide. Yeah, thank you all. I saw you trying to take pictures. Yeah.
Great, thank you so much. So time for questions, and those of you that are online, you can either unmute or type your question into chat, and we'll be monitoring that.
I have a question.
Yes.
And I'm not in psychology at all, but have a little bit of an awareness. I'm thinking about in psychology that what I heard termed the fifth wave, when there was a focus on Southeast Asians and Asians, and the big changes that they made in psychology through scholarship and through the kinds of things that you're trying to do with your focus on Arab Americans, focusing and changing essentially the field of psychology, I think pretty dramatically. Are studies around Arab Americans, the kind of work that you're doing, are they influencing your discipline of psychology? Are they a small piece? Is it growing and like, poof, is it going to explode? Or?
I would say it's a small piece that's been growing. So to kind of give an example, a few years ago, the American Arab, Middle Eastern, North African Psychological Association was created, AMINA-SCI. So the organization's about 5 years old, and I think that kind of shows, it gives a good picture of where we're at in terms of the psychology research. Yeah, there's kind of a few prominent names, and we're growing. A lot of students are getting more interested in it. And some people may have heard the term SWANA as well being used in kind of grassroots organizations to talk about Southwest Asian communities, North African communities, and Arab and MENA communities are kind of consumed under that too sometimes. And so there's kind of some collaboration there as well in terms of SWANA and MENA work. Yeah.
So you can lead the charge in this too.
Yes, that's what I'm hoping. That would be great. Yeah.
I'd love to see that. I was wondering, I didn't catch some of the demographic information that you collected on the folks who responded. I wondered about stages of development and whether something such as spirituality or collective decision making or any of these were seen more in older Arab Americans or younger Arab Americans. If there were differences.
Yeah, so some of the kind of like supplementary analysis I did was, looking at mean differences in terms of on these dimensions. I looked at gender, generational status, immigrant generational status. That was one I was really interested in. We didn't see any significant differences in terms of what they were endorsing. But I also did a qualitative study based off this research as well. And I think a lot of the nuances were captured in there, because even with collective decision making, there were some participants that really spoke about how they felt like that pressure was actually holding them back, whereas some folks didn't speak about it in that way. So I think those pieces are really relevant to consider.
I'm glad to hear you say that. I'm a mixed methods person.
Yes.
I think
Yes, I love qualitative.
Qualitative can really inform, the more quantitative, such as taking a statement and one person thinks about it one way.
Yeah.
The next person could think about that statement
in a very different way.
Culture on decision making, for example, a different way.
Definitely.
So, wonderful.
Thanks.
I was just wondering, are there any sort of recommendation that you would like to make on the institutional level? I asked this because in my personal experience, I identify as an other on the phone, right? And one of my support resources here, for example, at CAPS, for the first time in my life, I was able to speak to a counselor who sees things from my perspective as a critical lens, right?
Yeah.
But she does not feel very supported here, and she might be moving on. I don't know what the story is, but from that perspective, I'm like, in the student perspective, we don't get that much support. So I was wondering, would your research sort of, do you plan to like, at the institutional level, this is what you need in order to support the student, support the people who are supporting the students, you know?
Yes.
I just wanted
No, that's a wonderful question. Yeah, I'm glad that you asked that. So I'll talk specifically a little bit about Purdue and what I know is going on. So I've connected with some of the Arab and MENA students on campus, and there are efforts right now to start a SWANA cultural center on campus. And I think part of this, right, and what you're mentioning is like Arab and MENA Americans, they're in this kind of weird juxtaposition of like you're hyper visible, your identity in terms of the media and what we see being perpetuated about Arab and MENA folks, but then you're invisible, right? Because when you're coming to check forms, you don't see yourself represented. And those forms have also larger implications in terms of, we don't have data collected on health disparities, right? So I think part of that is, right, like uplifting those students that are feeling really energized, because that part of that movement is to say like, hey, we're here, right? We're feeling like we're not here, but we are here and we want to make our presence known. And I think a SWANA Cultural Center is a really excellent next step, because a lot of this research also shows that fostering that like sense of belongingness and community helps with identity development. And I think that kind of cultural center can do that. So I don't know if that answered your question, but I know because you talked specifically about seeing a therapist as well, but let me know if not.
I feel like even at the administration level of Purdue,
Yeah.
I feel like it could be more policy driven way, that's just like a general opinion,
Mm-hmm.
to sort of retain that support for the students, you
Yeah.
know, because if we're losing people who are just like us,
Mhm.
where does that leave us, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. Uh-huh.
So I think we got time for one more question. There's an online question. So Mike, did you want to?
Sure, you can see on the screen there, Martha asks, how does a scale like this and others accommodate individuals who may not identify with a certain dimension as important to them?
Mm-hmm.
Or are the dimensions considered universal?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't think the dimensions, I don't think we can consider them universal, especially with all of the pieces that we were just talking about. And, you know, for instance, like the one that's right, spirituality, collective decision-making, those are two kind of stand out to me that may not fit for certain folks. So this is kind of my tension, right? That's why I love qualitative, but I also love quantitative work. But in thinking about it, especially like in a clinical sense, I feel like something like this can really be used more so as a guide. And then maybe in the research sense, thinking about how we don't have to necessarily use this measure as a collective, but we can use different dimensions of it. And that's still something that's really very much a work in progress. But yeah, for now, I feel like it's just kind of a really good roadmap of getting people to critically consider what we assume to contribute to well-being may not always be the case.
Fantastic.
And speaks to the use of the scales that you've based your scale on, and are they applicable
Yes,
to Arab
because they're being used
Americans, right?
for them,
Are the
yes.
norms
Mm-hmm.
on this group?
Yeah.
And so if not, you've
Mhm.
done a wonderful thing here.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody.
All right, Dr. Schepers. And if you could stand back a little bit from the
Yeah, I
owl,
was-
then people can see
Want me
your
to move
face.
the owl forward?
There we go, that's a good idea. There you go. Yeah.
Sorry.
You're right.
Hi, everyone. My name is Ofelia Schepers, and I'm going to speak to you a little bit about the book that Wayne spoke to, Dr. Wright, and really dig into one of the chapters of a pre-service approach. And I want to dig into the book first because I want to express that part of the reason that the book came to be was this: as we were developing a pre-service approach to trauma-informed practices, we were noticing that there was little work that we could rely on to really think through how this would look. And so we started asking, right, we're seeing this increased attention and resources that are really focusing on how to think about and understand how teachers should think through trauma-informed practices with students in K-12 education, but really weren't seeing this translate to higher education. So the vision and development of this series came from that need for our need, right? It was really personal. And so when we put out the call, we were really specific in wanting to know about practices that were happening that weren't only trauma informed, but really had an equity lens to it as well, really thinking through facets so that, real processes that think through not pathologizing students, but really using it as a source and tool to support teachers and students in classrooms. And so We also were able to see people that were doing research within their practices that they were using, and that will be a forthcoming text specific to the research approach to it. This particular piece that I'll be talking about is in the book that's Reflections from Teacher Preparation Program, and really focuses on the implementation of the program itself, which will eventually lead to researching how effective and impactful it might be for our pre-service teachers and then in their classrooms when they get in. So again, the focus is program and implementation and really thinking about preparing future teachers and highlighting this particular chapter. Really importantly, that I don't want to forget, they grew from this collaboration between Metropolitan State University of Denver and Resilient Futures, which is a nonprofit that supports integration of trauma-informed, equity-focused practices in education spaces. So the relevant research that we were seeing, and I spoke a little bit to this, was that there is this prevalence of childhood trauma that is being focused on. It's more noted. You're seeing a lot of it in the news, and so we're really understanding what that means. What does it mean for students to have childhood trauma? And the research really shows that students can't learn if they don't feel safe, known, and cared for within their school, and really being able to provide that also includes understanding how their backgrounds and experiences, including traumatic experiences, impact them and how to support that. And so, as I mentioned, also schools that implement trauma-informed practices are successful. We're seeing some of that. It supports students and academic and social outcomes. And educators who work with students are also exposed to secondary traumatic stress or vicarious trauma. And while those two constructs are different, we mostly, when we see the work in trauma-informed practices in K-12, it's really on the student. We're really focusing on how students are experiencing trauma-informed practices. Are they becoming more successful? How are they being supported? And really the focus for us was how are we supporting teachers and pre-service teachers? How are we thinking about their resiliency as well? So, and not an either or, but how do we do both? And so the book itself has variety. I think it's about 16 chapters, and they took various approaches. And so it was really informative to us as we did our program implementation, understanding what other folks were doing. And it was very varied, which is really gives higher education institutions different access points of where they can start, or individual instructors of where they can start. And so we saw people using picture books, authentic collaboration, writing prompts right within their courses, course addition to a program, student seminars, and curriculum integration. And so the chapter I want to talk to you all about is incorporating trauma-informed practices into one teacher education program. And it really took a two-pronged approach. And a lot of the background research that provided a need, as you can see, was very similar to the need for the book. And also really thinks through this research that's showing that K-12 education systems are addressing trauma-informed practices, but there's this large lag on how higher education is implementing it and supporting that as well. And so that was, our hope to meet some of that need and really bridge that gap so that students could leave pre-service programs and feel confident in their classrooms around supporting students with childhood trauma. And so the tip practices that we relied on was a part of the HEARTS model, which is out of UC San Francisco, Dorado and Friends. And there was a set of practices and policies that have 6 guiding principles: understanding trauma and stress, cultural humility and equity, resilience and social emotional learning, safety and predictability, compassion, dependability, and really empowerment and collaboration facet as well. And so those 6 guiding principles really led a lot of the work that we implemented. And it became, so this particular piece began as a collaboration and conceptualization of trauma-informed practices in teacher education. We were approached by National Mental Health Innovation Center and at CU Anschutz with this request of how can we see this in higher education for pre-service teachers. And we were approached because MSU Denver is the second largest teacher prep program in the state, and it graduates about 300 of the teachers in the state a year. And so we were then connected to Resilient Futures for a collaboration. It was a 4-part, Resilient Futures supported in many ways, and one of them was providing a 4-part trauma-informed practice professional learning series for our students. So students were able to go to these 4 parts to really get an understanding of those 6 guiding principles, and it was optional and it was free of cost. And between fall of 2018 and 2020, spring of 2020, 400 participants had gone through one of the modules. 140 had completed all 4 of the modules. So the seminar series, again, was compressed into 4. So though there are 6 guiding principles, they were compressed into 4 sections. I believe they were 4 4-hour sections, 2-hour sections. Thanks. 4 2-hour sections. Sometimes we would put them together, and they do 4 hours, 1 in the morning, 1 in the afternoon on the weekends. We did evenings, really trying to get time for a commuter school. It was difficult in trying to figure out timing that worked for our students. And so really the goal of that, though the seminars were fantastic and really helpful, was getting a curriculum integration, right? We didn't feel that a 1-course approach was appropriate. We felt it was really additive, and we really wanted to see it integrated into the course, to all of the courses. And so we took this convenience, intentionality, and institutionalization approach. And so with convenience, we were offering, as we asked faculty to integrate this into their courses, we wanted to ensure that they also had access to the professional learning series. And there was what I'll call the TIP team moving forward, was a group of 2 faculty, myself and a faculty member from secondary department. And we had a part-time director of trauma-informed practices who really facilitated the writing of the grants through foundations. And the 3 of us worked in collaboration, so the 2 faculty members were able to get course release time to do this work. And so it made it, this buy-in from our administration, really supportive in really making this move forward. And so with the gaining of grants is when we hired the TIP director, and they really kind of moved the process along. And the grant funding paid for the seminars. That's how we were able to really provide these at free of cost for students. But with long-term TIP integration without grant funding, it's really huge. Like, how do we make this sustainable? And so we really looked at what course integration would be the key to making TIP within the School of Education really sustainable for our program. And so we offered with the grant monies opportunities for faculty to develop and design within their syllabi, identify how they could integrate trauma-informed practices based on the 6 guiding principles that we had. And so we developed mapping exercises that supported the faculty so that it was not as big of a burden as having to look at all of the TIP guiding principles. We broke it down to specific things, student learning objectives that they could see within the course, but started as easy as having them map core guiding principle, cultural humility and equity. Is this in your course? By reading, what each guiding principle was, or might it fit in your course? And so we actually found that the core guiding principle of cultural humility and equity was really embedded in one of our courses already, but we didn't want it to just live in the multicultural ed course. We then asked other courses as well, like, are there facets of this that you see in your classroom? And so it was really iterative. Faculty that got the mini grants were also able to meet with the Resilient Futures team with one-on-one consultations to really further think through the guiding principles. And then they would update and annotate their chosen syllabi and then teach that, right, going through that process. And so we really learned to have a feedback loop. It was really iterative, and it evolved greatly as we progressed. The mapping sheet that you saw was one of many. That was the initial one. That was the really friendly one. We had a massive Excel spreadsheet that we had documented all of the courses in the School of Education and identified through the syllabus that's turned in where we thought it might fit before we even approached faculty that taught that. And so the other facet was really being intentional. One of the key pieces for TIP content was to be explicit. What we found were that folks were doing some of these things already. And being able to say, you're doing this, see how this ties in, and then encouraging them to be explicit with students. I made this pedagogical move because it aligns with trauma-informed practices in these ways, and this is how it supports you, and this is how it can support your students if you use that as well. And so really just walking through and making it really accessible and thinking about intentionality as they progress in their shifts in their courses. And so we really, the goal was to institutionalize it. And it can be really hard in higher education to make any shifts to syllabi. And so it was really intentional that we didn't say, we want you to change all of your learning objectives and go through curriculum and do all of the things. And but we wanted them to think about it. So official course syllabi shifts were really encouraged if they had had substantial shifts, so that, you know, when faculty moved on and somebody else was teaching that course, we knew that it was a student learning objective that was solidified, but we didn't push for it. We really left that decision for department and individual faculty, and really, really honoring academic freedom that faculty hold. And so that was really important for us. And then having a team in place to oversee the implementation was really critical in the sustainability phase in institutionalizing it. Really thinking through the map integration of courses every couple of years to see incorporate new changes, using original mapping exercises and examining learning objectives and making shifts as necessary. So really the biggest constraints was that because of funding, the program grows and shrinks as funding comes and goes. And, you know, thinking about overburdened faculty, asking too much of them. And so how do we streamline it to where we're asking just enough and supporting in ways that are also trauma informed? Really, that was the key for our process to also take that into consideration. And the mini grants to honor time spent on course shift early payment. And so, you know, there's going to be this continued need. I think COVID-19 really just exacerbated and really highlighted things that were already happening. And so teacher preparation programs really need to ensure they're developing teachers who understand how students learn, how to assess students, and how they deliver instruction, right? That's already something they have to take into consideration. And so adding this additional piece needed to be integrated. And so while this particular piece was really programmatic implementation, there has been a lot of research facets that have come from that. So I've done a lot of secondary traumatic stress and pre-service teachers, and then it really fueled into in-service teachers when we got the Spencer grant to really focus on interventions within in-service teachers to really support teachers in the process. And, you know, my hope is to really do this in biliteracy methods as well, really integrated it into language and literacy. Thank you.
All right, questions either from in the room or folks online, if you want to raise your hand, unmute, or type your question in chat.
Hey, I was wondering if you looked for or found any ways to integrate these practices while pre-service teachers were working in the field, like during practicums or student teaching or anything like that, so they had an opportunity to apply what they were learning?
Yeah, when we first started, our goal was to support, we only had so many slots. And so we offered it to students that were in student teaching and students that were in the residency year, and then students that were in field. And so when we got more money, we also expanded it to all students in all fields, even the early field. So we first prioritized our pre-service educators that were working with children. Very intentional. Yeah, thank you for asking that.
So this model of integrated sounds a lot like what we're doing or trying to do
Yeah.
with LDT and integrating technology throughout. But there still is a course that kind of captures, I don't know, what it's going to do. So that's a pretty robust, like, I'm wondering what your role was, because we don't have a TIP team, right? And so what would be the feasibility or what resources would you need in order to replicate something of this nature here at Purdue?
Yeah, so it was a very collaborative. The course release was huge. That allowed us to kind of look at all syllabi, put it all into, develop all of the forms, really talk one-on-one with faculty. So that was what made it really sustainable for the folks that were working. And we didn't get a director of trauma-informed practices until we got foundation money. And that foundation money was intended to only focus initially on early childhood, because people love to give money to early childhood. And so, everyone thinks about it differently. And for us, early childhood, goes until second grade, which included our elementary ed folks. And then we opened up the seminars to secondary, all the other departments as well. But yeah, so we actually had to integrate English as a second language, we called it culturally and linguistically diverse practices into all of our program area, because the state mandated something. And the way it was done was not helpful. So as we were reflecting on the fact that it was technically in courses, but it wasn't, it was just 2 classes, then we started thinking about how to do that. And so it was really helpful, but it was helpful to have administrative buy-in that supported, even with course buyouts to some degree. I think you said something else that I'm forgetting, but yeah, I don't know, I'll get back to it.
Well, I'm thinking of the TIP team, like you had a core group of people who were invested in making this happen.
Right.
And so I'm wondering how such a group could be established here, or if you're starting to make those
Yes, I'm
connections.
slowly but surely thinking, because I know that's a goal for the College of Education here as well, is to really think about that. And adding another course is sometimes hard, right? For us, we couldn't add another course. We were stuck to the 127 hours that students, right? And so we have a lot less wiggle room in the College of Education because of licensure. And so it also helped that the state was mandating some of these hours.
Which could be a problem here, since there's legislation like anti-SEL trying to be passed now, so
Right.
that's worrisome.
Yeah. Well, one of the things I think you said was that there is a technology course. Some of the content that we began to understand was that understanding trauma and stress was going to be hard to fit into any of the courses, except for early childhood. They actually had a really intentional psychology class, that ed psych class, but not all of our programs were required to take it. And so that was a seminar that, as we move forward, will always be offered to students.
Got an online question from Ariana.
Yeah, I don't know if you can unmute or not, but if you can try unmuting, Ariana. If not, if you can just type the question.
We can't unmute
She
it.
shows as muted, but I've given her the mic. I don't see it. Yeah, and I'm trying to, I apologize, this is my first time using this.
So, Ariana, why don't you go ahead and type in your
Yes,
question?
if you
We'll take
would,
a question
please.
in the room and we'll get yours in a second.
I apologize.
I was just wondering, in your research for the future of CASEL and anything like that, have you ever looked at cyber trends? Like, for example, we work with a lot of technology like stopping bullying or bullying, or is it more like trauma experiences with the child, like attitude?
So we look at both, so insidious trauma is one of the big facets that we take on as well, which is really looking at like what's happening in the environment. So racial trauma, community trauma that gets taken up, how schools might cause trauma. And so I think that it could capture trauma that is caused within technological spaces, but we haven't intentionally or we haven't explicitly said that. So, but I think it definitely, as we look at trauma ourselves, like, and one of the things that we want to ensure is that teachers are not therapists, they're not psychologists, we don't want them to be. We just want them to feel supported in knowing what to do. And so there are some folks that'll like have students take the ACEs, which is a childhood assessment to see like what childhood trauma you've had. We discourage that. We assume that like these practices will help people that are, that have experienced big T traumas, right? Deaths in the family, community violence, and then also are experiencing like these insidious like racial trauma, systemic trauma that's caused by systemic issues. And so I think that would capture that as well.
Great, we got Ariana's
Yeah,
question.
so Ariana typed, I apologize, I couldn't get it unmuted. What are some practices that people commonly were already incorporating that they didn't know were trauma-informed practices?
Yeah, great question.
She
So,
has, thanks to your brilliance. So.
Great question. It was really interesting to sit with faculty, and they were looking at this as just a big matrix of ideas that seemed new. And so as we started to get into their syllabi, some practices that were in the syllabus that they didn't do. So I'll give an example. If you hand in a paper late, you're going to have a deduction 5% points every day until it gets turned in. And by day 10, you just get an F or whatever it was, right? And so we were like, that is a non-example. So most people had it in their syllabus, and they're like, oh, I don't do that. Here's what I actually do. And they're like, if the student reaches out to me, I'm happy to provide the supports on extending time as needed. Sometimes we sit and develop a plan of what makes the most sense. And I was like, that's trauma informed. And so, quite a few of the practices that we started looking into the syllabi practices first, like attendance policies, grading policies, what all of those look like. And some of them looked really, really strict and really punitive. And so as we talked about it, we realized we don't do those things, right? We adjust for students. And so the really big key was being intentional about putting that in your syllabi and taking out the punitive pieces. And then when you are making these pedagogical moves, talking to students about why you're doing this and how you could do it in your K-12 classroom. So it was really also being trauma informed with our students in higher ed, yeah.
I think that perspective about being non-punitive would fit so well in the classroom management courses that pre-service teachers take. And if they would maybe just refashion it a little bit, the syllabi in those classrooms, and recognizing that all learning is social emotional, getting that big idea, out there, would be really valuable, I think.
I think so. It was very intentional, and it was really helpful for students and faculty.
Sure.
You've got a couple more comments there from Brianna. I admire that you all collectively initiated this work at the higher ed level within, and faculty reflected on their own practices versus seeking to fix K through 12 schools and start inward to outward approach. Love it. And then Brenda, first, this is great. Thanks for sharing with us. I agree with Ariana. You're brilliant. Question, was this project completely pre-COVID, or if there was a continuation during the pandemic? If so, how did COVID have an impact on these seminars, particularly in regards of trauma that students, teachers were undergoing at the time? And then thank you.
That's a great question. It started pre-pandemic and continued. And we used to do them in person, which was really helpful in showing students and faculty how to integrate fidgets in the classroom, right? They got to, we started putting in all of the education-specific classrooms, they'd have bins that had, if students needed to color while you were presenting, or they needed a fidget, those materials were available for them. So when we went online, it was really thinking through what are the online practices of being trauma-informed, like breaks or, whatever that might look like. So we got to experience having to think about how technology impacted how we delivered these. So they all became online, and then the timing of those and being okay with kids in the background, right? Because a lot of our students were non-traditional students. And so, so we got to experience both. And I think now we're back to a hybrid model. We kept some of that for student need as well. But.
Got time for maybe one or more questions?
Yeah, back to the integration thing. There were 3 folks in Ed Studies who were working on, for I2, integrating, like aligning with the CASEL standards and that sort of thing. But all 3 of them are gone now. So I'm wondering if there's any OCP folks who were involved in that who can figure out how to pick up that thread, because they had already identified where to integrate it in like learning and motivation and the behavior management or that class. So maybe, Kristen, do you know what happened to that? You know what I'm talking about?
I do not know. I imagine.
It was Mandy and David and.
I imagine I wasn't asked to be on there because I'm doing so much else.
Things, yeah.
But with my counseling experience, I definitely think this is a very important topic and something we definitely need to be working on through I2. So it does kind of work into 2 grants I'm working on that are really kind of integrating social emotional, positive psychology kinds of modules into classrooms to identify students with high ability based on their personal strengths. Okay. Right. That may not be captured in a one-day standardized test.
Right.
Yeah, so, but yeah, it's definitely, Tara, something I'm interested in, but I hope we do continue, really, yeah.
But a good question. So how much of a mini grant is needed to motivate a faculty member?
Well, it depends. At MSU, I think we did, was it 1,100 maybe is what we were able to capture. Yeah, and it was enough buy-in to have you dig into the standards, and it was, we had quite a few, when we had the mini grants, people were more willing to do it. And so after we were done with that funding and didn't have any more for that, it was on the administrative, so our dean said, this is really important to us. For our strategic plan, we want to ensure that departments continue this work. So ensure that one of your meetings really focuses on actively doing some of this. So set aside an hour to have people look at their syllabi. So
I guess related to that, for the students, because 140 doing this on Saturdays and other things. So I know it was free for them, but were there other things you did to incentivize the students coming even at that time?
I think just food. Did we at some point do we didn't do gift cards?
Credit for the state, state standards too.
Yeah, so they get
Like PD credits or, okay.
Yeah.
I hope it's a quick question. Like Tara, I'm very interested in the curriculum integration piece because we all know that, from research, that's the way we're supposed to do it in regard to everything. And yet, when there's follow through on it, very often what people term curriculum integration is still only adding superficial 1 or 2 little hits on social justice or anti-racist education or something. When you reviewed pre-tip syllabi compared to what they were doing afterwards, did there seem to be genuine thread running in the course?
Yeah, so initially we started with that easy step of what can you add?
Right.
And so we then shifted and developed another massive spreadsheet where when they added it, was it at the development level? Was it at I should know these terms, but BPD, I'm trying BDP. Anyway, so at what depth? Are they just learning it and memorizing it? Are they actively doing something with it? And then are they creating something with it? So really looking at parts of Bloom's taxonomy. And once we identified that, we then started looking at what other assignments do that as well. And then pushing to say, like, is that deep enough? Like, is mentioning it deep enough? Because they're going to hear it again in this other class. It's going to be circular. So really thinking through those facets. Towards the end, like, we really started to get folks that would take quite a few of their units and ensure that it was integrated into all of them, specifically literacy, right? How they can incorporate books that really addressed and opened up space for them to talk about some of the guiding principles really strategically. Yeah. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much. Well, while Megan's coming up, just another announcement. So 11:45, I think the lunches will start coming in. Those of you that are online, that are on campus or in the building, I think we ordered 30 lunches, so there should be plenty. If you want to come down and grab one, that'd be great. And I just need to apologize in advance. I got a dissertation proposal defense at 12, and so I won't be able to join you for lunch. So when I run out of the room, just know that. Yeah, but I encourage you to stay and continue these great conversations.
We'll try not to talk about it.
Try not to talk about it. Thank you. All right, Dr. Brennan.
That was such a great setup for what I'm going to talk about. A lot of the different questions and reflections. So I'm really excited to jump into this with all of you because social emotional learning is such a huge component of trauma-informed practices. So that's what we're going to dig into today. So as has been mentioned, I'm one of the co-founders of a nonprofit called Resilient Futures. We're out of Denver, Colorado, and we work with early childhood, K-12, universities, community agencies, you name it, to implement, but really most importantly, sustain trauma-informed, equity-focused practices. And I think my journey to this work, I want to share a little bit about it because I think, we all have our own paths and that's what makes it really sustainable and important. And so as a school, I spent my whole clinical practice as a school-based therapist, and I loved being in the schools so that I could see kids in their natural environment. I could watch them on the playground with friends. I could see interactions between staff and students. And then I also had the support of all these other adults to really help implement the skills that we were working on in therapy. And I'd worked from early childhood up through high school. And how I ended in high school was, some of you might remember about 10 years ago, there was a pretty bad shooting in Aurora, Colorado in a movie theater.
Yeah.
And the community mental health center where I worked, which supported that school district, the school district asked us as a community mental health center to staff therapists in every single school at the beginning of school because it had impacted the community in such a huge way. And we had such a good relationship with the school district. And so I had always been on our crisis response team too. And I was placed in a high school where 80 of the students were at the theater complex that night.
Wow.
The theater itself was used as a triage center, which I think they would not have make that decision again, but it was really an immediate need. And then one of the students that had just graduated died as well. And so the amount of trauma that was in this school, and when I first got there, everybody thought, oh, I'll be here for about 2 or 3 weeks, and I ended up staying for 3 years. And so much of the work I did, definitely supporting the students and families, but also these one-off conversations about, educating people about the impact of trauma on behavior, on learning, why some kids that weren't in the theater were also having these really big responses and behaviors, and same with some of the teachers as well. And I kept thinking to myself, there has to be a better way to do this. And serendipitously for me, one of the women that's also one of the co-founders of Resilient Futures moved to the community mental health center where I was working, started, and she brought with her something I'd never heard of. She brought with her a trauma-informed program. And she came to our school-based team and she presented on it. And I remember sitting there thinking, like, this is what I want to do. Every single person needs this information. And so I slowly, went from doing the individual and family work, which I really loved, doing the more systems work, and eventually leading community mental health so that we could start our own agency because we really wanted to centralize equity work as part of the trauma-informed work. And the HEARTS framework that Ofelia also mentioned has always done that from its inception. It's the only trauma-informed program that has done that since its inception of really prioritizing equity work. And so Laura had been trained at the University of California, San Francisco in the HEARTS program when it was brand new. And then we started implementing it locally in Denver and now, nationwide too. And as Ofelia mentioned, there's 6 core guiding principles that really ground the work. For our purposes today, I won't go into all of those, but if you want any more information about it, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. One of those main core guiding principles is cultural humility. And I really appreciated, a lot of the conversation that happened in some of the online questions about, doing the inward work first before we move outward. And that's really what cultural humility starts with, is doing that inward work, that self-reflection, our own learning to examine how our biases and our own cultural histories and racial histories are showing up, and then being able to take that outward. There's 2 other main tenets of cultural humility. One is recognizing and challenging power imbalances, and the third is institutional accountability. And with all of our partners that we work with in trauma-informed practices, we really want to move to that institutional accountability where all systems, all structures, all interactions are really through that trauma-informed, equity-focused lens. And cultural humility, as many of you might know, really moves away from an idea of cultural competence, that, that this overgeneralization of groups of people and trying to, make assumptions and somehow everybody's lived experience fits into that one, overgeneralization is just not the best way. And so this lens of humility, of really being curious about other people's lived experiences, really moves us to that, first inward and then outward work. So I'm thinking about social emotional learning, wanting to first situate ourselves in this context of COVID-19. All of us in here probably had really different experiences of the pandemic. For some people, their experience was that it wasn't very stressful, but for the majority of people, it was incredibly stressful. The lack of predictability and the isolation, just such a dramatic shift in day-to-day practices. And so what we know from the neuroscience around brain development and trauma and the stress response is that when we're in those prolonged periods of stress response and activation, that our executive functioning and our learning brains are really offline. And so it's hard to concentrate, to pay attention, to access our memory or input things into our memory. And then working with other parts of the brain to really focus on that emotional regulation, which is often what we're talking about with social emotional learning. And then times of great stress can also bring up past traumas as well. And for a lot of people, this was activated in this prolonged stress response during COVID-19. And so lots of different entities have declared a youth mental health crisis. And this crisis was emerging before the pandemic and then really tipped during the pandemic. So that first stat, and I want to acknowledge that I do this all the time, and these stats are really hard for me to read and internalize too, because it's a lot, and it's a lot to think of our youth being in these positions. So, 1 in 6 youth age 6 to 17 before the pandemic had experienced a mental health disorder, and now it's 1 in 3. More than 200,000 youth have lost a caregiver or a parent, and then disproportionately, youth of color have lost way more people in their immediate family, caregiver kind of circle of aunts, uncles, relatives, good family friends, and loved ones. So between, these are why I brought my notes because I wanted to make sure I had my stats right. Between 2017 and 2019, I believe it is, the suicide rate increased dramatically in youth to become the second leading cause of death in youth across our nation. And actually during the pandemic, suicide rates dipped a bit, about 3% nationally. But during that same time, suicide rates for Black males in these 3 age groups increased. And Black youth endorse thinking about suicide and creating a plan for suicide 50% more than white youth currently. So there should be a slide after this that I don't know, I guess I deleted it accidentally when I saved it, but that also talks about the racial pandemic that we're going through at the same time. And the racial pandemic is not a new pandemic. It's been a pandemic since, for hundreds and hundreds of years. But the president of the American Psychological Association publicly came out and named it a racial pandemic and talked about mental health needs to really address the racial pandemic as well. We know that experiences of racism or witnessing racism or racial violence can exacerbate the stress response and cause racial trauma. And that's not my lived experience as I identify as white, but we know the prevalence of racial trauma at that micro and macro level that was talked about earlier. But we also know the incidences of hate crime are the highest they've ever been nationally in the last 12 years. And hate crimes are really underreported, and it's hard to get something qualified as a hate crime too. But that's just a little piece of just the context of what's happening for our youth right now across the US. And so with that, prior to COVID, schools had really started to shift back to incorporating social emotional learning, had really kind of gone away, and now the scales are tipping to have it come back. And as a psychologist, knowing how important social emotional skill building is and social emotional learning. And like someone said, all learning is social emotional learning. Can't learn the academic stuff without having strong social emotional skill building. And, I've worked with hundreds and hundreds of kids and adults, and that's the place that we always start, is with social emotional learning. And so this definition comes from the Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning, otherwise known as CASEL. And CASEL has, really done a lot of the research nationally on social emotional learning, and many of the curriculums that schools use to teach social emotional learning are embedded in the CASEL model. So programs like Second Step, like the Incredible Years, Conscious Discipline, all of those are really rooted in these 5 competencies that CASEL's created for social emotional learning. So they're self-awareness, self-management, responsible decision-making, relationship skills, and social awareness. And all of those are embedded, thinking about it within the classroom, within the larger school community, families and caregivers, and then also with the larger, thinking about them within the larger community as well. If you haven't ever been on their website and dug into all their information, they have quite a bit of research and information about all of their competencies. And so we're going to go through 2 of the competencies just for time's sake today, of some reflection and then critical learning that we've done and changes that we've made as an agency to really apply an equity lens to these competencies. Our executive team at Resilient Futures is a cross-racial team of women, and our agency is a cross-racial team. We prioritize in our training as a cross-racial team as well, so that we're bringing in multiple perspectives all the time, and not just highlighting one lived experience. And so that wasn't possible for my talk today, but that is generally best practice for how we regard our working community. And so for self-awareness, CASEL defines that as the ability to understand one's own emotions, thoughts, and values, and how they influence behavior across contexts. And then down here, these are some ways that can be done. And that fourth bullet point, examining prejudice and biases, that was only added in 2020 to their definitions. We used to just add that on our own, and then we're happy to see that in 2020, CASEL did add that piece. And then this is their overview of relationship skills. So the abilities to establish and maintain healthy and supportive relationships and to effectively navigate settings with diverse individuals and groups. So some of their pieces for that are communicating effectively, developing positive relationships, demonstrating cultural competency, resolving conflicts, constructively and standing up for the rights of others. And as somebody mentioned earlier, we know the importance of relationships and well-being for students and for adults. And so that's why I wanted to highlight these two for this talk today. And so it's interesting because CASEL's been doing this work in schools for a really long time. And what they've come out and said now is if they were going to do it all over again, they would have started with the adults. Because it's really hard to teach and model skills that you don't have. And not because you don't want to have them, but maybe you were never taught them in your family of origin or, throughout your lifetime. And that's something, in trauma-informed practices, we come back to a lot because everybody talks about trauma-informed practices as supporting all students, and really it's supporting the adults in the building. Because we're thinking about that lens of cultural humility, we're always starting with ourselves first in making changes, in adopting practices, and then, taking them outward. And, when we think about trauma-informed practices, the reason why practices is part of the title is because it's not a destination. It is an ongoing, lifelong practice of, knowing yourself, knowing communities, being curious, knowing that also the science is changing with what we know about the brain and about learning. And so what I learned in my grad program, I learned that the brain quits growing at the age of 18, at the end of adolescence. We talked about the impact of trauma for maybe 30 minutes of one class. All of this information is new and so important and also changing just because of our technology. So also acknowledging that piece as well, that, all of this is a practice and will continue to evolve too, that, we're on a journey together. So we first adapted the introduction to the CASEL competencies to be more inclusive of all the different identities, some of which have been talked about today too. And we highlight at the beginning academic rigor, because as Ofelia mentioned, sometimes trauma-informed practices can be seen in this really deficit way, and same with social emotional learning. That social emotional learning is always for the other kids. It's for, title schools, it's for low-income kids, it's for kids of color, it's for language learners. And social emotional learning is for everybody. We need it throughout our lifetime. But we want to, make sure that we're talking about all of our different identities as part of that social emotional learning. So cultural identity, linguistic identity, racial identity, and gender identity are all fundamental to social emotional learning. And the comment about right now in legislatures, across the U.S. passing laws against teaching social emotional learning, and we're facing some of that in some of the districts that we work in Colorado too. And it's so, it's so different district by district too. We haven't done it. We don't have that right now at the legislature. At that level, it's really more school board level for us. But in some community, when we go out of state and we are presenting, we've been told sometimes we're not even allowed to say the word equity in their space. It's so just the swing that's happening right now. So we really focused on the ways that cultural, linguistic, gender, and racial identity intersects with social emotional learning, and really, wanting to highlight too that, all of those identities are marginalized, but when we add the intersection of race to any of those marginalized identities, the oppression gets worse. And so that's why racial identity you'll see throughout is always specifically named, because if we're not naming it, we're making assumptions that everybody knows what we're talking about, and everybody doesn't know what we're talking about then, because people are really comfortable talking about some oppressions and not very comfortable talking about others. And almost always talking about racial racism and racial discrimination is one that people are uncomfortable with. So switching our explanation of self-awareness. So the ability to understand one's own identities, emotions, thoughts, values, biases, and prejudices, and how they influence behavior across contexts. This includes the capacity to recognize one's strengths and limitations with a well-grounded, culturally, linguistically, and racially aware sense of competence and purpose. And so if we're thinking about our own self-awareness and our own learning, but we're not thinking about how these identities show up for us and how these identities show up in others, and then how that is influenced, then we're missing such a huge contextual component of this work. And all of this was done, we did it collaboratively as a team, so with different racial perspectives and cultural perspectives and linguistic perspectives represented as we were going through this. And so then, highlighting a few of the examples that were used, and in purple is what we've changed or added to bring that equity lens. So for that, for integrating personal, social, cultural, linguistic, gender, and racial identities. When we just say personal and social, that just, it's so ambiguous. That what do we mean by that? And mental health and psychology is really good about being ambiguous in the past, and it really, that decolonization that needs to happen in mental health so desperately, to really be specific about what we're talking about is so important. And so then that next one, identifying one's emotions and considering how they relate to, your own personal and social, cultural, linguistic, gender, and racial identities. Different cultures see emotions and experience emotions really differently. And we need to account for that in how we're thinking about social emotional learning, and not teaching social emotional learning just through one box and one normed perspective. And when we're not considering this, what we see so often is social emotional learning, like I said, becoming weaponized and used against students, used as a way to force compliance, used punitively, as almost as a discipline measure. And what we really want is it to be supportive, to have it acknowledge students' strengths that they're coming in with, not be deficit focused, and really identify, honoring all of those different identities. Again, connecting feelings, values, and thoughts to all of those separate identities. It's really important to be considering that, everybody's lived experience is so very different, and honoring that lived experience as we're doing it. And then the last one, challenging racial biases and prejudices and resisting racial traumatization and re-traumatization. And so like what was talked about before, trauma happens outside of school, trauma happens in community, it happens in homes, and it happens in school. And so, doing our best to challenge racial biases and not perpetuate them and not cause racial trauma or re-traumatization. And when we do, then we apologize and we make changes and we do it differently so that no other student needs to experience that. And that's that institutional accountability piece. And there's the video that we use in a lot of our trainings is the two founders, Melanie Turvalon and can I remember their name? I'll think of it in just a sec in my brain. Talking about how that's the place where most people get stuck is in that institutional accountability. And that's the place that we have to continue to come back to and practice and work on. Any questions about those? I know I'll ask questions at the end, but I'm also good with asking them in the moment.
I do have a
Yeah,
question.
please.
Challenging racial biases and prejudices, and like learning to sort of say, well, I did it and I'm sorry. And now I'm going to move forward with a better informed idea of what to do.
Yeah.
I think that all sounds really good, but I feel that, and I'm not slamming our undergrad population, but I think they're pretty easy and gentle on themselves and have a little bit of a checklist mentality, like,
Yeah.
I read this and I did this, so therefore
I know it.
So how do you keep pushing at those points, or?
100%, and I think it's the integration that Ofelia was talking about, that it's never a standalone, that it's part of so many different classwork in areas, and so it's coming from all different directions and lots of time to practice, you know, hearing it from in different spaces. Because part of what we know too is, you know, speaking from my white perspective, white people often don't have a lot of skill in staying in racial conversations. Our stress response gets activated. Robin DiAngelo coined it white racial stress. And we have the same stress response of, you know, then we want to fight, flight, or freeze. So we get defensive, shut down, start arguing, get angry, we leave and won't engage any further. And so helping to build that skill and that muscle to be able to engage in that is really important.
I appreciate the idea of it being in the multiple different places that they've experienced, so they don't think it's just happening in multicultural education.
Totally.
That I have to think those things. So that's helpful. Thank you.
And, you know, we talk to schools about this that are schools that are all white students. They need to have this, you know, as much of an emphasis on racial literacy and education, more so, you know, because, you know, it's this, all of these practices are not just for diverse schools, which is also a misconception that happens when it's only being taught in one course, and there comes that association that, oh, I'll just get through this course and then I never have to think about this again.
Yeah.
So it's interweaved in all of our, you know, foundational trainings and our ongoing professional development. It's woven in throughout everything.
Quick question too,
Yeah.
just related to this, because I'm guessing this has to do with that idea of social humility. And so you say that was like offered as a counter to cultural competence.
Yeah.
Say more about that, because that's new to me. That's really intriguing, because I was bothered by the fact that at some point you can declare yourself culturally competent.
Right?
It's like, check a box, I'm there.
Yeah.
And so they talk about how, because there's that idea of cultural competence, they're healthcare workers, and so it's now cultural humility has been applied to lots of different disciplines. But because they had these preconceived ideas through this lens of cultural competence, that they were missing so much of what she says, like verbatim, like what people were coming to their healthcare center with, they weren't even asking about, because they weren't curious. They had these preconceived notions. And so instead of thinking, oh, because this person identifies this way, this is what I learned in my multicultural class about this group of people, this must be true, you know, actually asking somebody about their lived experience, asking about what's important to them, asking from their cultural lens, like what that feels like or how they want to proceed, and honoring it too. So it's really this lens of curiosity that they talk about, and it is such a significant shift from how most people continue to be trained.
How do you hold that together with a CASEL framework that is built on competencies, right? It seems there's just a different spin on that. It's really interesting.
And I think that idea of competency is such like an American ideal, right? That we are gonna work hard, and then we're gonna be really good at something, and I'll be the best, and I never have to learn anything else because I'm competent and I've learned my discipline so much, and that's, you know, that's it. And that's why people get stuck. And this is the exact reason why we want, you know, when we formed Resilient Futures, that one of our huge goals was to infuse trauma-informed practices in pre-service education. This is such a side note from this, but every training we do, people come up to us and say, why wasn't this part of my teacher prep program? And it's so easy, it's easier to have a mindset be part of what you're learning as a discipline than shift mindset later on. So the next one is about relationship skills. And so this one, again, we added in the purple, but the ability to establish and maintain healthy and supportive relationships, and to effectively navigate relationships with people from different ideological, culturally, linguistic, gender and racial backgrounds. And so what we know, and the research shows us over and over and over again, is that for the majority of white people, they only know white people. And so then when they are in interactions, whether it's with students or colleagues, you know, not taking into account these different identities that are being presented for somebody else, not having that skill that we just talked about to stay engaged in difficult conversations, or conversations that just present information differently than might be how I'm used to it. So then, you know, coming down, it also includes the ability to function across different cultural, historical, and racial contexts, and to seek or offer help when needed. We know the focus on relationship building between students and teachers and how important that is, but also thinking through this equity lens of that, relationship building in and of itself isn't always enough. I'm going to show you some student data in just a minute, but what we often hear from students in the communities that we work with is that they don't feel connected to teachers, but teachers feel connected to students. And so we know we're missing some component there. So we updated, again, these bullets. The first one, engaging in cultural humility. So again, moving away from that idea of competence to this idea of humility, to develop and maintain relationships with people from different cultural, linguistic, gender, and racial backgrounds. Communicating and solving conflicts respectively, considering the cultural, linguistic, gender, or racial backgrounds, even during times of stress, trauma, and or culturally and racially tense situations. And then seeking and offering support and help when needed, and standing up for the rights of others without minimizing or patronizing school community members of different cultural, linguistic, gender, and racial backgrounds. So those are all really big things and components. And so again, it's a practice. It's first the awareness, and then being able to engage in practicing skills and having opportunities in lots of different places to understand, what does this mean for my school community? What does this mean for my particular classroom and the students that I interact with, and for myself too, and how is my own cultural and linguistic and gender and racial backgrounds also coming into play in all of this. So at the top, you can't see the heading, but it says, I feel like I belong in this school. And this is data from this spring of from a couple of different elementary schools in one district that we work with. And we can see the how many participants from each elementary school. It's third, fourth, and fifth graders. Some surveyed all and some did a sample, which they are allowed to do. And so I feel like I belong at this school. Very true. Only one school has half of students saying that they belong. True. Covers, as you can see, around that 30%. Somewhat true is a little lower, and then not true isn't very high for any of the schools. But knowing that belonging is so important for learning, This is a school, all of these schools are incredibly diverse schools with almost all white staff. And so then this next question, trying to leave lots of things for questions. So we also asked this question if students at the school are respected and valued regardless of race or cultural background. And so very true. It's really different across the schools. True, somewhat true. And then in one school, almost 10% of kids surveyed said not true. And so really finding out, asking the questions that we really want the answers to, so that we can then start to make shifts and changes in those practices is really important, because in the data from school staff, it's close to 100% say that they have strong connections with students, and that they, and regardless of race and cultural background.
Are you able to disaggregate these data to see who feels it's not true?
So unfortunately, we're not. We don't get access to that part of it. I wish we did, that part of the data, because that would be incredibly helpful. And we're trying to get the school district to do that. So hopefully that will be the next step.
Can you look at, because each of these bars is a different school, right?
Mm-hmm.
Are there any patterns in terms of the demographics of the schools in these bars?
The demographics is almost exactly the same in all the schools. It's about 45% Hispanic students, about 30% Black students, and then very less than 2% of white students in all the schools.
Interesting.
Mm-hmm. It's all from one theater elementary area. And when this data is shared with the school, it's really difficult. It's shocking for the school staff, but when we have the right data, then we can start to make better choices about what to do next and how to proceed so that we can make sure that all students feel seen and respected and valued for all of their identities. Sorry, yeah, it's just not working. And so we, applying an equity lens, not just to CASEL and social emotional learning, but to everything that we're working with, all, when we're getting a new curriculum, when we're doing a new social emotional intervention, when, we're adding curriculum and changing coursework to really making sure that there's those multiple perspectives. And, that equity lens is really being used to think, are all of these different identities being considered and the impact on different identities being considered, and what are we missing? And sometimes we don't have all the right information, and then we adjust course and make changes. But bringing this lens all the time is such an important part from our perspective for trauma-informed practices, and knowing that equity and trauma-informed practices can't be separated, that they're 100% intertwined. And if a school or a district or a community isn't doing equity work and saying they're doing trauma-informed work, from our perspective, they're not truly doing trauma-informed work until the equity work is centralized. So I wanted to leave lots of time for questions because you have both Ofelia and I too. If there's more questions from what she talked about too, we can answer some of those as well. But happy to answer any other questions too.
Thank you so much.
First, I want to say that I have to admit that I don't know very much about socio-emotional learning, but actually between these two presentations and even the earlier ones, it really helped. And this particular slide, because of my interest, really helps me understand that what I'm interested in is actually fundamental to socio-emotional learning.
Yeah.
Whereas I was kind of sticking it out there, thinking it was somehow something different. And when our Associate Dean Kathy Ogenchain talked about infusing it in our program, I'm thinking, oh, what are we going to do? But that really helps me see that, again, I'm doing it and multiple other people in our program, I think, are using these kinds of lenses too. So thank you so much to both of you for that.
And we know, again, I'll say it when, I feel like we can never say this enough, that when students aren't regulated, when they're in that survival part of their brain, that they're not able to engage in learning, no matter how amazing the lesson is, no matter how engaging the activity is, and not because they don't want to, just because whatever's happening for them, whatever happened that morning or that week or whenever that's being triggered in them, biologically, then their survival brain takes over. So social emotional skills are so important for regulating, so that students can engage in learning. So thank you. Yeah.
As a white female school counselor, addressing especially trauma that is historical and generational. So I feel so inadequate and wonder, am I really helping? I mean, I went to a conference and one of the speakers spoke about trauma-informed practices. And one question that I thought, oh, I wish I would have known that when I was in K through 12 was, when you're talking to someone about something that went wrong at school, whether that be a discipline thing or a relationship issue, to ask not what's the matter with you, but to ask what's happened to you, and then listen. And so,
that's the fundamental, overarching question.
Shift, right?
Right.
It's just a very simple shift
Right.
of the question.
And right there, you go from being deficit focused to asset
Yes.
focused
Yes.
in just simple shift of language. And I love what you said too about then you listen, because as adults, sometimes we're really in a hurry and we have lots of stuff to do. And so we don't always really listen. And that means being really present and not trying to problem solve, not speaking for kids' experiences, not making assumptions, just really listening. And that's hard. And that takes practice too. And I had wished I had known that too in a lot of my school-based experiences
Yes.
as well. Yeah, and then, as we learn new things, then we incorporate them, right? And we get better and we do better, and that's the point, for sure. Any other questions?
I have a little one. I read about the big T trauma and little T trauma. Do they, in your research, manifest themselves the same in kiddos? Like whether it's a series of just little tiny things that most of us would say, oh, that's no big deal, you'll be fine. Or if it's a big, horrific experience, are kids still kind of going through the same physical, emotional, mental reactions to those?
That is such a great question. So it's so much more complicated than yes or no, and that's how great the science and the neuroscience to help us explore this, is so wonderful. So we know there are some things that are so horrific that anybody that experiences them is going to be traumatized. And so there's a difference between experiencing trauma and being traumatized. And so you can experience a trauma and you have a lot of support around you. You have caregivers that help you through it. You have your own resilience factors already, and your trajectory is that, oh, that was challenging, but I made it through. I'm not traumatized. You can have a sibling that has the exact same experience and maybe isn't as close to the caregiver and so can't rely on that caregiver as much, doesn't have the same resilient skills, who then becomes traumatized. And it is an individual experience. It's not up to any one person, clinician, diagnostician, anyone to decide what is traumatizing. It's that own response to the event that makes it traumatizing or not. And so when I was in school, we only talked about those really horrific big T traumas like neglect and sexual abuse and physical assault. And now we know that lots of experiences can be traumatizing. One of the main supports and resilience factors is having caregiving adults that believe you and support and work with you after. So that's a great question. Thank you for asking it.
I have more of a comment statement. Do you feel that it could shift in the classroom if our administrations would allow teachers of color to bring more of their culture into the classroom?
Yes.
Because that will help balance out the traumas that students are facing if I can recognize a little bit of myself in the person who is educating me. I feel like oftentimes a lot of administration, we have a box of this is how we want our teachers to look. They have a box of this is how we want our school counselors to behave. But the reality is that it's not how they are acting outside of the room. So they're putting on this mask, if you will. So in a way, it keeps perpetuating the trauma with the student and with the student now in the classroom setting because they're not able to be who they are. They have to fit this image of this is what art teachers are supposed to look like.
100%, and then staff of color leave because they're made to fit into a box that isn't authentically who they are, and that's one of the reasons for staff leaving. So 100%, and I always think about there's such a push for culturally responsive education, but why do we need culturally responsive education, right? That's the question that we need to answer, and it's because education is white normed. And so then we have to learn ways to bring other cultures in when instead it should be more culturally responsive, respecting all cultures and identities from the beginning. Any other questions? It's complex and it's heavy and it's a lot. So I appreciate everybody asking questions and engaging. Yeah.
You touched on this a little bit, but like you said, state legislation and pushback on critical race theory, then people somehow thinking that SEL is the same thing and not being able to say equity, just some of the insanity. How do you work within that? How do you find the space between this work?
from these restricted environments?
That's a great question. Luckily, there's a lot of interchangeable words you can use, right? Because they didn't tell us we couldn't say that word. We are really steadfast in our values and our commitment of equity work being centralized in trauma-informed work. And so actually, we won't even work with a school partner if they're not engaging in equity work. And that's going to look different for lots of school partners, but there has to be some active, like, this is a value of ours too. And, you know, it may need some resourcing and some help, and but that's the only way that we'll work with a school partner in the first place. That more happens when we're off doing one-off trainings. And so we do tend to just substitute where it's right now. You know, who knows how strict it will get. But there's some, yeah, it's really concerning and shocking what's happening, and especially around social emotional development, because it's not, you know, Ofelia and I've talked about this so much about critical race theory, like what they're talking about isn't even actually what it is, you know? And so, like, sometimes I'll be in a community and we're new in a community and I'll hear, you know, like somebody talk about white privilege and decentralizing whiteness, and it, like, I can feel that physical response of, oh no, is that okay in this community? And that's horrible to, you know, that there's that, it's that tense and just like walking on eggshells everywhere, because every community is so different too.
So with our graduates, pretty intentional about saying the teacher shortage. I mean, they're going to have their pick of jobs, right? So they can be intentional about asking the right questions. Is this a school system that is going to support, that understands this language, that has this as a common goal, and run away if it isn't? But I do feel bad for the schools where that answer is no, right? Because they're going to be, who's going to be left to teach in those places?
It's so complicated, right? And we always talk about too, like, listen to what the questions are they're asking you, because if they're not assessing for your knowledge around equity, then they're not valuing it, because they're going to ask questions around their values as well, you know? So it goes both ways. And, you know, part of that institutional accountability piece is we help school partners and districts really revamp interview questions to be more trauma informed and really try and, you know, get at some of all of these principles. And it's okay if people haven't had that experience, but having that open mind that, yeah, this, I believe this, I just don't have a name for it, you know, is what they're looking for. Yeah.
You know, a comment from just a couple minutes ago from Bianya, just saying, just a comment saying that our systems are white, Christian, heterosexual, cisgender normed.
100%. And that's, there's a lot of work to be done to deconstruct all of that and relearn. Yeah.
So I've talked a lot with pre-service teachers about this issue of trauma-informed practices. And one of the consistent themes that keeps coming up, and you touched on it earlier, is you know, the idea that teachers are not therapists, and there's kind of some fear around that. Like, there's a real desire to understand students and, you know, to respond in an appropriate way, but at the same time, kind of an uncertainty over where that boundary is between, like, what it means to be a teacher and what it means to be a therapist or a friend. And then I was overhearing a conversation the other day. A student who's doing a practicum was talking about, like, she was just there observing, and the student was just kind of like unloading on her, like, all these mental health issues, and she was like, I just don't know if I can handle this. Do you have any advice you would give? Like, what would you say to pre-service teachers who are concerned about that, like, who want to be trauma informed, but also are kind of afraid of, or not uncertain about what that looks like?
Yeah, I think that's always a concern. And trauma-informed practices are really thinking about those universal things that you're doing for all students. You never need to know if a student had an experience of trauma, but we're always questioning and wondering that question of what might be happening. What might have happened for the student before, what might be happening in the community that, you know, because all behavior is communication too. and thinking about, okay, so how do I set up and structure my classroom, my routines, my rituals, my social emotional learning to support all of my students, regardless of what backgrounds they come in. And, you know, all the research tells us right now that youth want to talk about mental health and adults don't want to talk about mental health. So any listening adult they can find, they are going to dump everything exactly like you're talking about. And so, yeah, there are definitely, you know, some teachers that we work with that are really open and students go to them. And so they end up hearing a lot more, but it's knowing also when to get the counselor, when to get your mental health person involved, that, oh, this is something bigger. So let's go, you know, talk to this other person and get you supports, because that's not my role and it doesn't need to be. It's getting that kid connected to the right resources. And often kids just want to tell us their stories. And sometimes it's not huge, big trauma. Sometimes it's something smaller that happened. And once they tell it, it's like, whoo, now I can just go on with my day. So making space for both, but really knowing what's available in your school community and in the larger community to connect kids and caregivers too. Thank you, everybody. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Just want to thank Rawan, Ofelia, and Dr. Brennan for these really wonderful presentations. I, along with Joanne, learned a lot today about this. Yeah, it's like, oh yeah, I guess I do more social emotional learning than I realized. And the work that your group has done to really infuse into that the racial, linguistic, cultural, gender aspects, I think is really important work. I'm told, Julie says lunch is on its way. They're on campus. I think they're making a delivery from the student center. So
That's right here.
Perfect timing. So Julie will direct you, and I've got to run to do the dissertation. So thank you again. I hope you can do the conversations.
Hey, Wayne, thank you for organizing the hearing.
Oh, thank you. Appreciate it.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you. This is the one we're talking about.
Yeah.
You guys can go over until 1 o'clock, so you're welcome to stay in here and grab a box lunch and eat your lunch right here, or you can take it and go.
Because